welcome to Whole Soul School and Foundation's Literacy Chats. I'm Marie Mohler, and I'm an author and an intuitive and a messenger of the rising hero's journey. I'm here with Paul Panzica today, and we're going to be exploring more of the rising hero's journey. And Paul, thank you for joining me today. Truly, it's always a blessing because we go on these adventures together. We've podcasted together before and some other podcasts that I do for Whole Soul Mastery, but here at the foundation, this is your first time joining me. And to our audience who's meeting you for the first time, I would love for you to just share a little bit about yourself, and then we have some things to dive into.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you for having me again. So, my name is Paul Panzica. I'm a physician, and I've been practicing over 25 years now. I specialize in internal medicine and pediatrics. I also teach at one of the local colleges, medical colleges, and I've done that for over 20 years. And we teach, or I teach basically pediatrics, but most of my time now is devoted to adult medicine, but my teaching experience is mainly in pediatrics. And specifically most interested in the non-physical. I mean, I've done a lot of medicine and I've worked in a lot of hospital situations, but you start to realize that a lot of medicine is really most of medicine, in fact, almost all of medicine, in one way or another relates to the development of human consciousness, which never ends until our death. So in that respect, when you look at it from a developing human being, from an infant to adulthood, that is really one of the essential elements of pediatrics itself. And so understanding how the human psyche develops, how we develop into whole and healthy people, that became really one of my greatest interests. And something that I did teach at a university level for quite a while was the development of the human being, and how that relates to holistic issues in regards to understanding the human being in a much more complex and comprehensive way.
Wow. You know, we are so multi-layered. And I think in many ways, our human conditioning has really narrowed our focus in many ways into more of this myopic vision. And if you can't see it, you don't believe it, right? That kind of mentality. And I find it so refreshing to connect with people that know and understand and continue to be in the journey and the quest for truth and the quest for understanding and the discovery of what we know inside, right? At a deeper level of soul, we know these things. And yet it is part of our human journeys to rediscover ourselves again and again. So, and that is a lifelong journey. That's a timeless journey that we're all on. And I have cherished you and my connections with you. I know you're a deep healer, an amazing teacher, a scholar, somebody who knows a lot of things about a lot of things. And there are people in the world who know things in that way, but you can synthesize it in a way that makes it accessible to people, at least people with ears and eyes to hear and listen. Right. And that's what you and I are both here for in this conversation with Literacy Chats. Part of the reason we really felt a calling to create this kind of conversation is the world is largely lacking the language. Humanity is lacking the language for our spiritual development in a place that transcends religion and that transcends all the conditioning and gets back to the heartbeat of who we really are, what we're really here for, what the journey really is. And I think that's also part of why, Lacey, when we co-founded Whole Soul School and Foundation, we wanted to give the language back to the people, and we focus so much on the hero's journey because so many times when people are in the phases and stages of living this process of self-discovery and transformation and all that goes with it, they think that something's wrong. They think that they've gotten off their path, or they made this terrible mistake, or there was this failure that they can't get past, and it creates these blocks in their journey. And we've been articulating and giving the language to, no, in fact, you're right exactly where you're supposed to be when that thing that you tried to create kind of imploded and didn't work out for you. No, that's exactly where you're meant to be, and giving people a language to work with whatever is presenting in their lives as in a way, kind of the nourishment, the soil, the composted soil that you need to grow to the next level. And so I thought, since it's a new category, this is a new conversation anyway for Whole Soul School and Foundation. In some ways, we haven't really talked about the hero itself and what we know, that there's a journey that makes the hero, but I thought you would be a fantastic messenger of the hero. And maybe we could start there, and kind of what initiates a hero, what starts to form the first foundation, the characteristics and the character of the hero that is in this journey, so we can better understand ourselves and why we are here. Why do we take these journeys?
Right. So years ago, I was at a medical conference, and it was with a lot of doctors who were already holistic practitioners and had some pretty good insight to many different modalities of practice. And there was there was a first day of the introduction of a 5-year course that trained me, or was part of my experience in training in holistic medicine. And the person that was running this program was giving an introductory lecture, and she stood up in front of everybody and she reminded us once again. She said, remember, there's no such thing as a silly question. And we're like, okay. And so she starts to describe like a kind of like a naive or a younger physician or a practitioner who came to one of the earlier conferences. And she said very meekly at the end of this, of the introductory lecture, she stood up bravely in front of everybody else. And she said, excuse me, but can you please explain to me the difference between the soul and the spirit? Everyone laughed in that audience that I was sitting in, as though it was the simplest and most ridiculous question that you ever heard. And I was just like, no, that's the most sobering question that anyone could possibly ask. And I venture to say that everyone who's laughing doesn't have a clue as to what the difference is, So, and it was even more interesting because that professor, who was the head of the whole program, and it was a very highly ranked person in this organization, was my mentor for that course. It was a week-long course. And at the end, I brought this up again in the group. And I said, you remember that question about soul and spirit? And I asked it in the group, and they didn't have a clue as to how to answer the question.
Wow.
So perhaps the first step in the hero's journey is having the courage enough to ask the question. Having the courage enough to seek the answer. Yes. That's the first question, or that's the first step in this quest. Because if you're not interested in asking the question or seeking the answers, then you will never, ever become a knower of this truth. You will never become a heroic soul.
I love that heroic soul. I love when that was the first time I've ever heard that, was through you, Paul. And it just resonates with every part of my being, the heroic soul.
Right. And so there's different ways to go about it, but a lot of people, and I would venture to say myself included, who are attending conferences like this for years, were searching for a method to obtain enlightenment. And there is no method. It doesn't exist. Not outside of yourself. So the method isn't, you can't obtain it through training. And there's a certain degree of training that we go through that help to discipline the mind and the soul, but there is no method to this process. And so that's really, I think, where a lot of the truth comes in regarding the hero's journey. And one of the things that for instance, Carl Jung said is, there's no method either. He said the same thing. He said, it's just life. Life is the way. Life will train you. And you have no idea what life is going to throw at you. So, to try to come up with a formulaic, type of process that you have to go through all of these steps to become a heroic soul, I would say maybe in some instances, but there's many, many different versions of that. So it's important that as we're moving forward in our enlightenment, in our ascension, in our expansion of consciousness, that we do begin to move away from these paradigms, because just because you don't follow that exact paradigm doesn't mean you're not going to end up in the place that you're traveling towards. Only you determine that with your higher self. And then, that's probably determined before you're even born. So there's many people who are saying that we're here right now because we did hear the call, or we're heeding the call, but maybe not in this life, maybe in many lives previous to this life, that we heeded the call to even incarnate into this plane of existence for this moment that we're speaking in right now. So I'd like to say that for most of us beginning this process, there's so much distortion that we live through that is unsettling to us at a subconscious level, that at some point it percolates to the consciousness, our conscious soul or conscious element of our mind. And we start to say, this isn't right. This makes no sense, right? So I think that we begin, in my opinion, like there's many different paradigms or formulas for the hero's journey. And so you can look at it. Theosophy teaches that there's something called the rays, the 7 rays. And that corresponds to there's 7 major planets, there's 7 days of the week. 7 is a very important number. There's also the 7 sacraments. And that's something that's practiced within the Christian religion, are sacraments. Now, there always begins with the same sacrament, which is renunciation. And so at some point, we say, all these truths that are being hurled at me don't make sense anymore, and I'm going to renounce them. Now, in the Catholic faith, or the faiths, they incorporated this in an opposite way, so that you renounce your beliefs and professed your faith in a doctrine that, let's face it, is never going to get you to the point where you need to go. So you need to reverse that now, and you need to renounce all the doctrines that have been promising you all of these answers, which are perpetually on hold, and you will never find them if you continue along that path.
Isn't that kind of like, in a way, like what we all grow up in many of us grow up in the system where you go to kindergarten, you get your little certificate, and you get to go to first grade and second grade, this promise of this life that you're going to live when you get your degrees, and then you get the final degree, whatever it is, and you think, and you're still looking for, but where is it, right? You didn't get what you thought you were promised in some ways. You still have to go seeking.
Right, exactly. And so so what is the religion? For many people, they're not religious anymore anyway. So a new religion was established that people are very unaware of. And it has to do with worldviews. And so I used, it's one of the things that I used to teach. I would ask this question to my students, and I would say, and it was in an embedded lecture. And a lecture was embedded within the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, I would ask, what's your worldview? And most of the students had no idea what I was even asking. What do you mean worldview? And I would say, yeah, that's my point exactly. You have one. You just don't realize that that's been programmed or conditioned within you. So what's the worldview that most people have adopted? Is a worldview that's promoted through a secular scientific, let's say, paradigm or community. And so that's the worldview that's being promoted through the media that almost all people are plugged into. And so if you notice, anyone who promotes that worldview is promoted in the media. And so, we've kind of cast away religion, and most of us have embraced some form of science that has taken the place of religion. And that within that form of science is a secular worldview. And I can tell you this firsthand because I was trained as a scientist, and I was in a family that cast aside, religion, and I had these questions that I always wanted answered, and thought that science would lead me to the point where science would answer the questions, like, why am I here? What's going to happen to me when I die? These types of things. And the answer is that they'll never give you the answer, number one, and number two, they're not even interested in your question. But it takes you a long time to figure out that they're not interested in those questions. Okay. So we have a form of science that offers us a worldview. And the worldview is simply this: what happens to me when I die? Don't know. What happens to me what happened to me before I was born? Don't know. We will remain silent on this subject because we do not have objective information to answer the question. So it will perpetually be unanswered. And so you have a worldview where the thing that the scientists in our society can tell us, the conventional scientists in our society can tell us, is that you live for a very short period of time in comparison to an ocean of cosmic time. The Earth is around 4 billion years old, and the universe might be 15 billion years old, and it'll probably go on for, we can anticipate, another 15 billion years. And so within that 30 billion years of cosmic time, you exist within that continuum for a micro fraction of a second, about 80 years if you're lucky. This was programmed into us, by the way, through, let's say, publicly and privately funded documentaries and scientific, kind of like hybrid documentaries and series that were run on very well-known platforms that we're all familiar with. So when we grew up, that's what we were told, that there's billions and billions of stars out there with no life, and that or maybe the possibility of life, but we'll never know. And then also that you're just this little accidental blip in an ocean of cosmic time.
Wow.
And so the worldview that you have come to accept through osmosis is that there's only oblivion that waits for us at the end of this life. And so as a physician who has been conventionally trained and is trying to sell you therapeutic options, one of the dangers is that when you sell that worldview, you are guilty of coercing people into things that aren't necessarily in their best interest. Why? because the only thing I can tell you with for certainty from a conventional scientific standpoint is that you have 80 years or more to experience consciousness in this plane, and then I can't tell you what the hell happens to you after that. So that is a worldview that is being promoted. And if you look at that worldview, you have to stop and think and ask yourselves, as a healer, is that therapeutic? Or
is that healing? Correct.
Is it a healing worldview, or is it a worldview that causes illness? That's a point where we can begin a journey into, let's say, well, that doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't sit right with me as a healer. And I sure as heck hope it doesn't sit right with other people who have been brought up with this toxic worldview, that's all there is to life, right? And so from that perspective, we have to look at these things that programmed us, or these ideas or these paradigms that we've accepted since birth as absolute truth, or as gospel truth, or as close to truth as anyone can possibly know. And then we have to examine those from a critical perspective to see whether or not that actually is how the world works and how the world really is. And so from that perspective, I think any person, whether they're spiritual or non-spiritual, can start developing the courage to ask the questions that eventually will free them from that paradigm. Right?
Precisely. I think that was definitely my experience. We don't need to go into all the details of the experiences that we all have, but I know that there was a singular point in my life when I had really big questions, and the people I thought that had the really big answers had none. And you can realize when you have to poke beyond the veil, you have to say, you poke it, and and then you realize it's like paper. And you're like, you have to tear down the veils that had been given to you and that we had accepted as truth. And you begin to go on the true hero's journey, which is asking questions, but truly seeking to find, not asking to get the little small box answer. The laughter in the room that you described at that lecture in the very beginning of your education, that in a way, that whole room full of people used the laughter to be the answer, because no answer was given, no answer was available to them. So the laughter was the medicine, was the answer. But many of us will see, and then we'll reflect on it like you did and recognize it, no answer was given. No one had a real answer for that question. We all come to a place, whether it's a health issue, medical issue, something in our life that doesn't have an answer. And I think, I don't know the percentage of people, but many heroes go on the quest. Many people activate in their journey when something can't be solved by someone else or something outside themselves. We realize that it's us that has to take the journey. We're the ones who have to figure out even what the questions are. And like you said, it's just getting started, being willing to ask the questions that are bigger than some of our boxes otherwise would allow in our lives. We sometimes have to ask bigger questions and be open to thinking bigger than the little lives we've been in previously. And you often don't know that you were asking small questions until you've hit a point where no one has an answer. And that's often a clue for me. I still run into that, because once that activated in me in my life, and I realized I wasn't going to get the answers, not just from the people I thought I should be getting them from, but really there were very few, if any, that had the answers. So I had to go to a much bigger picture to start to put the pieces of my life together and to start to form this path that gave me the strength and the courage and the scaffolding to go the distance in my journey, and then go through the process of gathering the meaning through the richness of the experiences. But you're right. I hadn't really thought about the hero's journey as it breaking down to the questions, beginning with the questions that we're willing to allow ourselves to ask.
Right. Right. And so if we start opening our soul, our mind soul to and what we have to do in that sense is we have to challenge authority, right? Because these things have been taught to us with authoritative way. I mean, we were punished as children for not regurgitating the answers that were being programmed into us. And even if you ask those questions in many of the schools that we grew up learning in, you were punished, or you were marginalized for even asking the questions. So you do have to. There has to be some kind of a force, or an impulse that rises within you to say, I'm not getting the right answers, and and you have to start distancing yourself from those conditioned authorities. If you think about it, it's so much worse in academia than anywhere else, where people who regurgitate the right answers are rewarded because they get the highest grades, and the less talented people who adhere to protocols are generally the ones that wind up becoming high-ranking officials within the academic system itself. So usually you don't have a really talented professor as, let's say, an administrative position. They're never rewarded, and so you have people that can adhere greater and greater and greater to protocols. Doctors are conditioned to follow the leader, and the idea to freely think is discouraged within science itself, but also within the medical profession, because there's protocols that are being created by forces that are unseen, that are really there to control human behavior, and also to control, to a great degree, your health, and it not in an optimal way. So all one has to do is break free from that. And all one has to do is take a walk outside in nature. And all one has to do, especially this time of the year, is observe a flock of birds flying. And ask yourself the simple question: how do they fly in that formation? How do they do it? And so then go to the scientific texts that exist regarding this. And the answer is, we do not know.
Wow.
So the other question you can ask is, well, how do they migrate? Go to a scientific resource, and they'll answer is, we do not know. So then you can just look at your hands and say, well, look at my hands. You see, this hand is a right hand, this hand's a left hand. But how do they have confirmation? What determines the shape of my hands? So you go to a resource, and the answer is, we do not know. I mean, it has something to do with genetics, but we don't know. I mean, how that actually works is a friggin' mystery. What about memory? Where's memory stored in my brain? Go to medical texts, scientific journals. Answer, well, if you look at 50 different scientific journals, you get 50 different theories as to where long-term memory traces are stored. But the real answer is, we do not
know. Right?
So you have this very limited form of science that exists for way too long, that's been propagating this ignorance, and that those who propagate that ignorance rise within that community and become the spokespersons or the superstars. So part of the hero's journey, and I used to always start my introductory lecture, was in the story of Oedipus Rex. And Oedipus which I don't want to get into all the details of, because it's quite a great tragedy, you know. I mean, there's all kinds of terrible things that happen in that story, and you can spend hours just talking about the story. But really, as he enters into the city of Thebes, where the whole story kind of like takes place, the city is being besieged by a being called the Sphinx. And the Sphinx is terrorizing all of these people that live within the city, and they're all terrorized. They're all just completely and utterly, you know, terrorized by this mythical being. And this was a chimeric being. It was a being that had the head of a woman and the breast of a woman, the body of a lion, and the wings of an eagle. And it would come down upon you, and it was totally silent. It would make no noise. It was very stealth. And before it would kill you, it would ask you a question. And that question was called the riddle of the Sphinx. So this was the riddle. And it was simply, what animal walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs at the end of the day? And the more legs the animal has, the weaker it is. Answer: human beings, man. So as a baby, we walk on 4, you know, limbs, and in our prime, we walk on 2, and at the end of our life, we walk with a cane. So that was the answer. Now, no one ever got the answer right. And so no one knew what would happen if you got the answer right, but they knew what would happen if you got the answer wrong. The beast would tear you to pieces. So our hero, Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus, he's confronted by this being, and the being asks him the riddle, and gets the answer right. And what happens to the Sphinx is it falls dead on at his feet, like almost like a specter, almost like a non-thing. It just dies like that. So it was really a figment or a phantom of the imagination, and it was the fear that empowered this chimera to begin with. Your fear empowered it. By taking the fear away, it dissipated. It went away, right? And what did that was inner knowledge. Now, I used to always use this as a reference point, because that's really where we are for most of us, is that when we're starting out on this journey, we're not what we were told we were, okay? Because, and I'll go into that in just a minute. We are a mystery to ourselves. We are the answer to this mysterious riddle. We are the answer. Mankind, human beings. We are a riddle to ourselves, but we contain within us the answers to all the mysteries. That's, I think, one of the major meanings of that mythology, is that you carry it within you. You yourself are a mystery. You yourselves are a riddle that needs to be solved. And every single person has different elements and aspects to them, and you must solve the riddle of yourself.
Right.
And that, right. And so that's where we would start.
It's so powerful. And for most people listening to this that maybe had never even considered a hero's journey, right? Who are just bouncing into this podcast for this first time, even people who listen to our other podcasts and the things that we share, there is this process of allowing ourselves to remember that everything that we need is inside. If we have the question, we have the answer. If we have the poison, we have the antidote, right? If we have the challenge, we have the remedy. We have all these things, but that is not what our world has mirrored to us, which also, tamps down, mutes down the whole thought that we could have these creative questions, that we could spend our lives being curious, because I do think, especially the conditioning of the modern world, it was probably always there. Maybe you could speak to that through centuries, but now with more, if we have organized religion, we've had organized education. In centuries past, there wasn't quite, there might have been rules and leadership and, threats of death or all kinds of things if you didn't comply with the rules of the day. But I do think also there was a little bit more time. People were farmers, right? People were doing things out in their lives. They were exploring a little bit more because they lived closer to the earth. In our modern world, we get to play for only a certain number of years and be in that creative imagination and that curiosity. And then we get shuttled into school and all that, and also going inside a building and less of nature and less of all these things that we do. In some ways it can sound dark or sad or but in a way that's what's happened to our humanity, is that the creative impulse, this curiosity that's a part of us, that's also part of the antidote that our soul, our spirit is trying to give to us. We even lose the awareness that we should be asking more questions, right? That we are the question asker and the discoverer, right? That is the hero. And yet some situation or some podcast comes along to plant a seed that wakes us up out of our very own spell in a way. And we say, why don't we know why birds fly in those formations? Or, you start asking these questions and you start to realize that there's a whole part of the conversation that's missing. And part, to me, of the hero's journey is going on the journey to have this conversation with ourselves that hasn't been allowed, not in the papers we've written or the tests we've taken and all the things we've done to succeed in this world. Whoever you are, many of us have been through that kind of conditioning. And it is so refreshing. I remember a little bit of fear, like you talk about the character Oedipus. I'm sure he's like sweating whether he gets the answer right, because it doesn't sound good for him if he doesn't. We all have a little bit of that trepidation to go against the rules, to start thinking outside the box and begin to ask questions like these. But I think, Paul, that's one of the things that I love about the two of us, is we have blown past that box and we are here to share the gifts that we've gleaned in the journey. I think another expression is coloring outside the lines, right? We color outside the lines. Many people are seeking that, but they don't know how to take the first step, right?
How many times have, growing up, or even to this day, how many times have you watched what seems like an engaging, artistically sincere documentary or film or movie funded by people in certain interests in keeping you down into that narrow perspective about how these things exist? Like, oh yeah, what does determine the shape of your hands, or what does determine how animals flock? And they'll go into all the permeations or the gyrations of the science of the day to try to explain it, and they never answer the question. They just, by the time you get done watching the documentary, you're more confused than you were before you started watching it. So they just leave it as an open-ended question. They never give you an answer, right? And so that is a form of obfuscation. And so you think that they're artistic, that they're sincere, and they're trying their best to try to answer the question. But the reality is it's just entertainment, and they never give you an actual answer as to what actually is behind all of these things.
So does the hero have to have some, do they have to have some catalyzing experience to wake up out of that system, right? You can call that an illness. You can call that's been my experience, that most people have something that's kind of shocking them out of their, well, that is part of the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell has coined these phrases, but it's just the beginning of being aware that you've been living in the ordinary world. You're just in the mundane experiences of your life, but you may not, in fact, truly be living. it seems like there needs to be this catalyzing factor that wakes people up that there could be something more.
Yeah. In Oedipus's story, he's fleeing one problem and walking into another, and he the environment around him is chaotic. There's almost always something that's catalyzing it. But I would ask what catalyzed it for me, and it wasn't like a life altering experience. I mean, now there is, but back then, things were pretty calm. It's just that things weren't adding up.
And you could recognize that, though. You were willing to recognize it.
So that probably was based on previous existences. And I always had open mind, and I always was looking from the beginning of my life for validation. And just because one person tells you something doesn't necessarily mean it's truthful. So yeah, I guess you can call it a skeptical impulse that was there, and that is really kind of the basis for the scientific process. That in itself is extremely important. And if you were to, let's say, travel to other worlds where they have highly evolved societies, or at least the mythologies where they have highly evolved societies, and they live far longer than us, they spend somewhere between 50 and 100 years in education.
Wow.
And becoming masters in everything that they study. Education is cherished. Truth is cherished. And so a free and clear mind is cherished, right? And so we have a very stilted system of education that doesn't promote that. And they promote just the opposite. They close children's minds, and they close children's souls. And that's what you wind up getting within the educational system. So perhaps I sensed it as a child that, from the first moment that they tried to send me to school, I was too young to go according to today's standards, I was way too young. But they kicked me out of the car, kicking and screaming, and dragged me through the doors. 27 years later, I finally finished my education. But I hated every single moment that I was in that environment. I hated it because I knew there was a better way to do it. And so, rarely you find somebody who can actually teach you something, and you venerate that person. And they say that those who are capable of wisdom, young souls who are capable of wisdom, intrinsically or intuitively know that when somebody's telling them the truth, and they venerate those people that do that. So yes, without the teachers going all the way back to kindergarten, without those human souls that were the epitome of human beings, then I would have had even a far more miserable time. But so there is an impulse within us to seek truth or to look for an answer when it's not resonating with us. And I would say that this happens to all people at a subconscious level. It's just becoming more consciously aware of it. And then the form of holistic medicine that I followed or was trained in cherishes education. Education is the most important aspect to human development. Is free and unfettered, truthful education. And so if we're not promoting that, then we're in trouble.
And is the antithesis of the hero finding itself, like its true gifts. That's why some people leave and homeschool, right? That's why some people choose to leave the box of that and open it up again.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so, I mean, to me, the essence of all of this is to, you have to develop a dialogue with your inner voice or your inner self. And you have to develop a level of of certainty, that makes you stand out from the crowd. And there's just a lot of people who aren't ready to do that yet, and they just want to go with the flow. I mean, listen, when I graduated high school, I had no interest in being a physician. I wanted to be an electrician like my father.
Oh,
Tried to get into the union, but the union was closed. The shop was closed, and they weren't accepting any new apprentices. This was in like late 70s, early 80s, because we were in a massive recession at that time. So I waited around for a while, and eventually I never got called, and I was like, I can't wait forever. So I reluctantly went back to school. But that's not what I wanted to do. And the reason I wanted to become electrician is that it was a relatively easy life. I would have been rewarded for. I would have done very well. I actually have a degree in electronic engineering, but it was stuff I was interested in, that kind of work. I would have, the union would have taken care of me. I would have worked to a certain point and retired, and I would have enjoyed a relatively comfortable life. But that is not what divine.
so was medicine your hero's path, your hero's journey?
Path. So you can also go by those subtle clues that exist in your life. That when your ego tries to deviate from those paths, you are invariably given choices, or these are forks in the road, where you have to make a decision to go back to the path, or do I create a new timeline and try to do something else? There is probably a timeline that exists where I was an electrician, or there's a timeline that exists where I was an electrical engineer, or a timeline that certainly exists where I wasn't with the person that I'm with now, or made wrong decisions or different decisions. But I do feel that there's an optimal timeline, and that's what the hero has to recognize also, the optimal timeline. The hero takes the optimal timeline, optimal path. And I have an extremely dear friend, if she ever listens to this, she should contact me because I haven't heard from her in so long. But she said she saw the path. And she said that I was on it with just a few others. And she said it was severe. Those are her words. She described it. She says, Paul, it was severe. And it wasn't like in a bad way. She says you just can't deviate from it at all. Right. And so this is
Your path, this life that you must.
There are other people on the path. There are other people on the path. And so that hero's journey is part of it is you're being led, and it's all a free will decision. You can decide what you want to do or what you don't want to do. And believe me, the spirit will give you usually a major choice right before you're committed to a further segment of the path. They say, well, you can continue on the journey, or you can do this instead. What do you want to do? And it was always moving forward. And what drives the person on that path is a quest for truth, is a quest to answer those questions that you have. That's what drives it. If any other time, if I decided to take an easier way out, I would have lived a life of leisure. I lived a far more comfortable life. And that's unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever how you want to look at it, that's what the path of truth, and that's what the hero's journey leads you towards. It leads you towards a much more difficult, go of it, in life. And you have to learn to live and to survive and to thrive, through your own autonomy. But it's not, don't ever get me wrong, it's not me, it's not Paul, Dr. Paul Panzica, or to talk about that as big damn ego, that's really what you build up in your life. That's not what's leading me. I don't make any decisions regarding this. It's the heart. And that's not my ego. And that's following a different path. And so that's following the true path. And so it's through that, through my connection to that, which is leading me along a path that, quite frankly, I never would have wanted to take. I never really wanted to take in many ways.
But your spirit puts you on it. And this is what helps when you're also thinking beyond the physical linear world. You, in all these steps, somewhere in them, you were recognizing that something bigger than you was guiding the choices you were making. And I recognize my hero's journey type choices, or is when my human wants to do this, which is what you're describing, and the spiritual side of me says, no, but this is what you're going to do. And it will even let me think that I'm sometimes going to go off and do my little human thing, but I always end up on that path because my higher self knows. But there's a recognition when, especially in the moments in my life where I could see the conscious part of me, the human part of me, did want something else. And yet another part of me led, which is that heart-led living, that we're getting more information, more awareness is guiding the choices. And it will take you down into those rabbit holes. It will take you into those pits and valleys. And this is what I wanted to bring up too, at least in this conversation, and we may talk about it again. There was an article that I read recently. I thought I might even have it on my desk, but I don't see it, where we throw around, I might have quoted it somewhere recently in a podcast, but where we throw around this term, the hero, right? And we have superheroes, and it can be used lightly even, right? This hero that, and yes, while the hero's journey is for all of us, a hero, like this heroic journey, has different characteristics to it when you really are stretching and evolving and expanding, and more of all of you has to participate in the journey to survive that experience, to transcend that experience. It's different than those like simple decisions and more of the mundane everyday experiences of our lives. We're called to bigger experiences. We're called to stretch beyond our comfort zone, and sometimes way beyond our comfort zone. That's more the characteristic also of the hero's journey. So when I say the hero's journey, and I do say that it's all of us are here to live this greater expansion, this evolution, this process of transformation, I also don't take that term lightly, meaning you just go to a 1-hour workshop and you get the certificate and now you're the hero of your journey. It's so much more than that. It can take decades to live this journey in many ways, right? And then only to turn around and at some point be ready to go on another one, right? Because you learn that the value and the meaning of life comes from embracing this process.
Yeah, I think the journey is indefinite. So, I mean, we're trying to get from point A to point B. Some people just want to go from 3D to 5D and skip the entire journey in between, right? It makes, I've always, and I mean, that may be for some people, but the journey itself is the experience, right? It is the show. It is the reason why we're here, is to go through it and to face these challenges. And I don't think it ever ends. I mean, it keeps going up to what, 12th density or something like that. It never ends. And so we just keep moving through this and learning and enjoying and through the experiences that we're having. And you can, I don't know, some people are different, but I know that when I go through an arduous journey, whatever it was that I was doing, and it was rough. When I recall that experience, I laugh about it. It was hilarious to me because I really cast. I mean, that was one of the things I think that a psychologically healthy person does, is they can let go of that crap that you had to go through. But
hold on to the nuggets of wisdom.
And how insane or how crazy that was, right? I mean, there's usually something to extract from it that is that is extremely valuable, no matter what it is that you're going through. So, man, I hope in 5 years we can laugh about what's happening right now. Maybe there will be a big joke at the end of it. I don't know. But if you hold on to the perceived trauma that was inflicted upon you, it gets you nowhere. It arrests your progress, right? And so it is one of the most truthful things that Campbell said, who, by the way, was a disciple of Jung. He said that you must follow your bliss, and what he meant by that is you have to let your heart lead you through your capacity to understand compassion and in a higher form of love. Now, you may be forced to do things that go against your best judgment. It's like, well, I know I'm being compelled to do this, but there'll be consequences if I do this, and my ego is telling me not to do this, but this is the only thing that feels right. But it's impossible to try to predict the outcome if you take that path that your heart is leading you, because there will be doors and portals that'll open up that you had no idea even existed there. So I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me also. So do what you feel is right, and don't let that egotistical mind dissuade you from its perceived consequences. Yeah, at some point you may be chastised, or you may be kicked out of the paradigm that has control over you. That may be a consequence, but it may not be a bad thing. It may be actually the best thing that has ever happened to you. I can't tell you how many times I've led patients, or helped patients through this turmoil. And the best thing that ever happens to them is they lose their job, or they lose whatever they were trying to hold on to, which was extremely toxic. And then they allowed themselves a higher level of freedom and followed the path that gave them the most joy, and they healed themselves in almost every instance.
And what you just described, it's so true that inherent in the hero's journey, while there's an arduousness to it, while there's a ridiculousness to it, while there's this dissonance, this cognitive dissonance inside it, if you keep going, if you keep walking the path, there is this freedom, this sovereignty, this liberation, this emancipation from things that were keeping you in a much smaller version of yourself. And sometimes we have to go through really painful things, largely probably at some level created by ourselves, because many of us are not ready to just quantum leap to the end. We are holding on to those beliefs that actually are the things that have to break away and release. So when we're going through things that are hard, it's usually something that we have to learn deeper skills to learn to let go of as we go further in the journey. And you and I both know, and I'm sure we'll be back talking about different characters and different things related to this hero's journey. But I'm reminded of, I think I brought it up to you before, the Pilgrim's Progress, which is an allegory that of kind of the Christian hero's journey, a story of faith, right? And having to find a deeper faith. And there's a character that is called to leave the place where everybody lives. They're encapsulated in what's called the city of destruction. It doesn't sound like the place you want to live in, but in fact, that may not just be a bad metaphor for our world right now. And yet the people in that place are like, this is all that there is, and you're not really supposed to go on beyond the limits of the city. And someone escapes basically, and very quickly in the story, someone gets out, and it, like kind of alarm bells sound through the whole community. So-and-so went crazy and they've left, and they can't even believe it. Well, one guy's cleaning out his room and finds the book, which is kind of like a map of what the guy was thinking about when he got curious enough to leave the city of destruction. And he goes on basically the hero's journey. This character goes on the hero's journey to ultimately the city of light. And it's like you say, if you actually arrive in the city of light and you look all the way back to the city of destruction, just in this perfect allegory where they think that's all there is. And you look back and you're like, can you believe I was living in that world and that's all that I thought was there for me? And everybody thought I was crazy because I left. And it's so great because there's all these characters who come and try and retrieve him to say, you don't want to go there. That's insanity. You want to come back here where everybody is, nobody's happy, but we're all together in it, right? It's so great. It's so perfect. This has been a story. It's like the human story. But isn't it interesting that still, as of yet today, few leave the city of destruction? Few do, because of the safety feature, because of the job that they could get, that they have the skills, they can get the paycheck. If they just keep showing up for work, their life will continue forward, and that'll be some sense of security. But once that hero gets summoned to awakeness, whether you're pushed towards it, pulled towards it, whatever it might be, once you have the breath of knowing something more, like once that book showing the kind of the map of the guy that was just a little bit ahead of him, once he knew, and he's like, wait, this is fascinating. You mean there's a whole other life? And his wife was like, look, it's me or the book. Okay. And that's great because it shows kind of how it goes in some of our lives. It's like, it's me or that. Make your choice. It's me and the kids, or it's that. How many people have to go through these facing these choices in their life? It's you being true to yourself, right? And if you make that choice, that's fine, but the rest of us aren't going with you, right? And that's the Pilgrim's Progress story, which he then, even when he leaves, he still has to, stumble and be challenged in the journey. And he's carrying this really heavy backpack on his back, which is kind of like all of his beliefs and his thought forms. And it's quite a journey. And that was written in the 1600s, that story, by a man who was imprisoned because at the time you weren't allowed to have any church services that weren't consistent basically with the Church of England, I think it was. And he's just like, okay, well, and the guy, John Bunyan, I think it was the author's name. He was like, I'm still having church services. Like, that's a choice. That's a choice. Right. You can keep teaching, the Bible and right, in this freedom of exploration and spiritual seeking. But what's going to happen is the or else part. If you keep doing that, something else is going to happen to you. And he made that choice, and he was in prison for like 10 or 12 years, I think, something like that. His kids grew up, right? Well, he was in prisons back in the day, weren't anything close to at least what we have now. And so amazing. But he, as the universe would have it, somehow he was not stopped from continuing to write and publish books while he was in prison. Can you just imagine that? So like that didn't stop his spirit from taking the journey and giving this gift of this story that I have read is like second, either tie with the Bible or second to the Bible of numbers of copies sold in the world, the Pilgrim's Progress, because I think it so brings the spiritual elements to life. Like it brings the hero's journey, but it spiritualizes it. It adds the lens of the etheric and this deep faith and this connection with source, right? Something bigger inside leading you forward. And this is what a lot of people, I think, are seeking, especially in our times when it looks like so many things are broken and heavy and divisive, and the energy of the people on the planet is kind of at quite a low in some ways if people really tap into this. Although there are these spikes of what we also call the Schumann resonance, where there's a lot of people like you're talking about of great faith that are helping to lift the darkness and invite people to step onto the journey themselves. And I think that's what people like you and I do. We actually, Paul and I both know, really, because we've been in the journey for quite some time, we know there's a depth to the darkness that is super unpleasant. It's super unpleasant to know about. And when you go seeking, you might go into some of those fire swamps, right? In the same vein, because we know the depth of the darkness, we also know the joy of the gloriousness of what it's like when souls do make those decisions for themselves and they extricate themselves from the quicksand of their own beliefs or the needing to conform, and they start coloring outside the lines, and they start asking the questions, and they start feeling the initiation of this call to something different. You know, you have to get to that place where the character in the Pilgrim's Progress knows, like, he didn't know he was in the city of destruction. It wasn't until some alternative was in his hands, and once that was there, he couldn't unknow that there was something better calling him forward. Whereas the people around him, he kept saying, would you just read the book? Because if you'd read the book and check this out, it's really cool. And they were like, enough about the book already. We don't want to hear it. We think you're weird. And you just need to stop and get to work and go back to who you were all these years before. We don't want you to change, basically. That is also part of the hero's journey, is that there are people who sometimes the journey is celebrated, but a lot of times it isn't. Right. And we have to find the language that can walk with us kind of as a mentor. That's why the characters in the mythologies that I love, when you bring it to life, when you talk about the riddle of the Sphinx or the Oedipus Rex or all the things that you know so deeply about. We didn't even touch on any astrology today, but at some point we'll bring that into the conversations. These are our mentors. These are the stars, like the North Stars, guiding us in our journey. And when you hang around with this stuff long enough, sometimes I've had to make some quick changes because that's just what my journey required. There was a fork in the road and I had to choose. But there have been other changes, Paul, because I've gotten better at the hero's journey, where I can try some things on for a little while and then I make the leap. Right? I try a new language on, I learn something new, and I can engage my life in a different way. And I can practice it. I can visual motor rehearse it, spiritual motor rehearse it. And then I'm more comfortable. And in this way, I think that's what these podcasts do for people, is that we are voices and messengers of people who've gone in many different aspects of this journey. Right? And we're still standing. We're still talking, we're still sharing, and we still believe that this journey is for all of us. But what we want to do is empower people to know it's your journey. No one's going to put you on the path except for your own higher self, a higher being, the creator, your spirit guides, something larger than life, right? Something in the realm of the spiritual realms. But I can't make anybody do it. I can't make my family members take this journey. None of us can. We choose for ourselves. And that's part of realizing this is a journey of sovereignty. And when you claim that for yourself, you're also giving others around you to choose it and to not choose it. Right? And, you know, we can hope that they would give us the same courtesy, that we can choose it or not choose it, and we're still loved. You know, it's still... Humanity has a lot of waking up to do, don't they, Paul?
Absolutely, yeah. And that the prison city in the book, what's it called again?
The Pilgrim's Progress. Oh, the city of destruction.
City of destruction. And the city of destruction, you know, just from what you're telling me, it's simply this. It's a world that puts conditions upon love. So it's a world of conditioned love. I will love you if you do these things, or if you don't do these things, I won't love you, and that's the punishment. So when we finally learn to let go of that, because that doesn't work, and it's a juxtaposition. You can't put conditions on that energy. You can't put conditions on love. It doesn't work that way, because when you start doing that, you create destruction. And you start creating misery and fear and illness. It's as simple as that. If you and it's really, it's just simply about free will, the free will to pursue, you know, your path, guided by your higher self in love, you know. And at some point we should talk about what love and wisdom really are, and they are the same. They're the same energy. I think I mentioned that before in another lecture. So
Yeah.
discussion. So when you get out of that city of destruction and you go to the city of light, you see that's the difference. That in the city of light, truth is and love is experienced as an unconditional energy. It's
Yes.
an unconditional impulse, and that's literally, you can call it many different things, but that becomes what they call unity consciousness. That you can, you ever go back and understand too that that's the way that we should be pursuing science in love. One of the things that they used to teach in esoteric schools, and this is an esoteric principle that an axiom that is one of the most important things that we can say, is that you can only learn wisdom through love. End of story. And so if there is no love in the relationship between the teacher and the pupil and the teacher, and the subject material that's being presented, and how that's integrated into your life to make it relevant, you can't ever learn. You're not learning wisdom. You're whatever you're doing is not productive. And so that's the only way that we can learn. We only can acquire this through love. And we can build upon that. We can understand that the best teachers I ever had were the ones that I loved. And I truly did. And that is missing out of the entire human experience at this point. It's become corporatized, and it's become hijacked, and it's become constrained. So that what we have now is a conditioned way of learning, which is devoid of all love at this point. There's no love in it.
And life force.
It is life force too.
Right.
And we're having so many problems that are related to this regarding human health, and all of these perceived conditions that we're diagnosing, and we're seeing in epidemic proportions, not only within children, but within adults. It's all related to this conditioning of love. It's what it's related to. So, in the future, like I said, you may have somebody who loves heating and cooling, or refrigeration, or wiring a house, or fixing a vehicle, and let them do that. God damn it, that's what they want to do. That's what they love to do. And there are others who write poetry, and there's others who will dance. And you know what? It all contributes to the benefit of society. And that one person is more important than the rest. And that's really how that love will flow in our, hopefully in our near future. I mean, you can say, oh, I'm a doctor, I'm so important, blah, blah, blah. And then my toilet backs up. And I don't know the first thing about plumbing, but then who's the most important person in the moment is the plumber. And don't tell me that what they're doing is not more important than what you're doing. It's just as important. It's all important. Anything that human beings are doing in a creative or in a constructive fashion has immense value.
Yes.
And we need to allow people to pursue those things that they love to do. And if you did that, you'd heal the society so fast, because you wouldn't put any conditions.
And we wouldn't even understand it necessarily as work. That's kind of how I feel.
Right.
I'm somebody who I think is allergic to like 3D jobs in that sense. I can't do things where you clock in and clock out, and you're kind of in the jobs that I've had where I'm kind of homogenized into a job description versus being who I am, right? But even though I haven't worked much in that world, I have projects from dawn to not even dusk to like well after midnight, because I'm so passionate about each one of them that it's just the most natural thing for me to be doing them all the time. I don't even think about, and if we didn't, this is a real thing to podcast at some point about, but if we didn't define ourselves by our income, right? If we didn't define ourselves, like you're saying, by our degrees or our financial, means,
Location.
right? There's another lifting off the page where we are free. And I don't feel time, just, we all know there are some vocations. I'm thinking of lawyers right now that bill by the minute, right? That's a whole world. Like, that's also a whole world that has us believing in that. But I actually really believe that just my presence is the gift, and the person I'm with is the gift. Like right now, being in this conversation with you is the gift in my day. And I'm right here, right? I'm not anywhere else in my life right now, but just right here. And that's a whole other part of the journey that we all are making, of learning how to be in presence, which is making room for the love that you're talking about and the wisdom to flow inside us. But when we're so busy being everywhere else, but in the present moment, we miss it. We might just miss it. And I think that may be a good note to close this out on, but for seeds for another day, because there's so many aspects of the journeys we're in. And I do believe people are craving the language, they're craving the stories, they're craving to see real people. And sometimes they want to hear from people who know a bit of the shadow, right? Know the shadow of themselves, know the shadow in humanity. And some people are seeking those. And I love the conversations between you and I, Paul. The connection we have is that we are full spectrum. We are full spectrum messengers, right? And we can speak to it all. And I wouldn't want it any other way in my own life. Personally, I would say, I'm glad that I have journeyed into many, many, many of those realms, because I feel like my life is so much richer because of it. And I understand way more than I did, certainly in my teen years. And even the soul who traveled many lifetimes before, who thought she might have known things or everything at that point. I feel like I've understood the human experience so much deeper because of the pains and the triumphs that I've had. A lot of people don't give themselves permission to just experience it all, right? And I think we're also messengers of that. So, Paul, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for joining me. It's always a blessing. And we'll come back and do this again. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us in these literacy chats, which we will be having more conversations in, because we want to give you the language for you to embrace more of the myriad of experiences you're having in your own journey. Even if you haven't even yet consciously begun, you're in it. And, we have to start sometimes even before we're ready. And we can all see that the kind of climate on our planet is summoning change of just about any kind. So we are grateful here at Whole Soul School and Foundation to be voices and messengers of that for you. We invite you to visit us on our website at wholesoulschoolandfoundation.org, and also on the places that you frequent on your social media platforms. You can find us there as well. And until next time, everyone, blessings. Thanks for joining us today.